economy. My name is Francesca and I'm Events Coordinator at Postcrash Economics Society. We are a group of undergraduate and postgraduate economics students campaigning to change the economic syllabus at Manchester. We began in 2012 and today we are a vibrant student society at the forefront of the debate discussing how economists should be educated. What we are advocating for is pluralism within economics, because currently only one approach is really taught at Manchester and most of universities, which is neoclassical economics, and this means a wealth of knowledge found in alternative perspectives such as post-Keynesian feminist Austrian are neglected. In addition, we believe the economic syllabus is lacking in critical thinking, real-world application and historical context, which means that economics graduates are ill-equipped to properly solve the economic issues that affect us all. I'd also like to let you know that this Thursday, the 22nd of October at 6 p.m. in the Arthur Lewis building, we'll be having our first meeting to plan for our conference next year. Anyone is welcome to come, you don't have to be an economics student. Earlier this year, we had our first ever conference and it was a big success, and so we hope to build on that for next year. In recent months, there's been a great amount of debate and discussion among economists, politicians and pundits over the effects of the radical policy proposal, People's Quantitative Easing. The scheme envisages that future governments would, via a public investment bank, issue bonds for infrastructure development, and then these bonds would be bought by the Bank of England as part of a quantitative easing programme. The debate has also sparked a discussion over the role of the Bank of England and perhaps the need for more unorthodox monetary policy. We at Postcrash think that more open debate within economics is a good thing, as it allows room for different perspectives and constructive criticisms which are so vital for economic understanding and advancement as with any other social science. In order to answer the question today, can people's QE fix Britain's economy, I'm delighted to say we have three speakers with us. Firstly, to my left, nearest to me, is Chris Giles. He has been the Financial Times' economics editor since 2004, and before that was the lead writer on UK economics. He has won numerous prizes for excellence in journalism, including Financial Journalist of the Year 2014 from the Wynkoop Foundation. To his right is Frances Coppola. After receiving an MBA from the Cass Business School in Finance and Risk Management, she spent 17 years working in various banks. Although she's no longer working within the industry, she currently writes on financial and economic matters for many websites, including Forbes, Piera, as well as her own blog, Coppola Comment. James Meadway has a PhD in economics from the School of Oriental and African Studies. He is currently chief economist at the think tank, the New Economics Foundation. Before joining that, James worked as a policy advisor for Her Majesty's Treasury and also was a senior policy advisor at the Royal Society. So basically, each speaker is going to take their turn to stand here and set out their argument about People's QE for 10 minutes or so. After that, there'll be a panel discussion for 20-25 minutes, and then that should leave about 25 minutes 30 minutes for questions from the audience. After the debate, we will be going to the SU bar, so please come and join us if you can. And once again, I'd like to thank you all for coming and hope you enjoy the debate. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm going to do about 10 minutes. I hope I won't go on. I like the Postcrash Economics Society. I always have since it started in 2012. It does exactly what students should do. It's engaging, it's agitating, and sometimes annoying people, and that's exactly what students should do. So I have a lot of support for, in quotes, you revolting lot here, as you're revolting against your students, but doesn't mean I support every wacky idea that there is. Far from it. I think it's a very important distinction to make, that if you can be questioning about what the sort of consensus or the authorities say, but don't necessarily believe alternatives are much better. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to tell you 6 things that are wrong with people's quantitative easing. I'm going to be pretty blunt about why it's not a very good idea. And I'm going to take as the PQE template the Jeremy Corbyn's document of the 11th of August. That was the only time he wrote it down, what he meant by people's quantitative easing. There are a lot of versions, and roughly a little bit from Richard Murphy, who is the guru or the person that he cited as the person who came up with the idea. So I'm just going to go through these 6, and then I'm going to talk about, well, 6 things that are wrong with it. Then I'm going to talk about some serious issues that I think we should be thinking about hard in economics where we have some problems. So problem 1 is there's a terrible problem with timing in people's quantitative easing. Jeremy Corbyn got in a right mess on this on the radio on the World at 1 sometime in August about whether you have people's quantitative easing at all times or you have it only in a slump. And he wasn't sure, he was caught live on radio, and in the end he said do it at all times. So you at all times you're printing money, creating money and investing that money in infrastructure through a very complicated off-balance sheet vehicle called the National Investment Bank. So what's wrong with that? If you do it at all times, what you mean even when we're in a boom, you're also going to be printing money. This is why it is completely correct to say it's inflationary. If you do it at all times, you're creating additional demand in the economy where you might well have no need for additional demand, and then you have no monetary control. This is exactly what we've learnt over many years in the 1960s, 1970s, creates an inflationary problem in economies. When people say this is Zimbabwe-style monetary financing, if you do it at all times, this is Zimbabwe-style monetary financing. So then if you take the alternative view, which is more where Richard Murphy comes from, not Jeremy Corbyn, is you do it only in a slump, then you've got to ask yourself the question, why are you linking infrastructure spending to the economic cycle? Why is it that if you were suddenly doing well and you'd half built HS2, you got to Birmingham but not to Manchester, you'd say, oh, let's stop, we're doing a bit too well now, let's stop that, or you're just building some houses, and then you stop because the economy is doing well. You really don't want to link infrastructure spending in that way to the cycle. So the timing of PQE is a right mess. The second thing Jeremy Corbyn kept on saying as a motivation for people's quantitative easing is that, well, we did ordinary quantitative easing between 2009 and 2012 or 13, I've forgotten exactly when it ended, and we gave 385 billion, he always gets the number wrong, it's actually 375 billion, but he always says 385 billion to banks. He says, we've given that money to banks. Well, we haven't actually, that's not what quantitative easing did. It's got a wonderful image in it, of course, it's a wonderful image of the Bank of England rapidly printing £50 notes, putting them in a wheelbarrow, taking them over to Goldman Sachs. Goldman Sachs spend one £50 note, they roll the other one up, stick it up their nose and snort cocaine out of it. Unfortunately, that is a lovely image to have in your head of why QE itself was such a bad thing, but it isn't the way it worked. The Bank of England went to great lengths to avoid the money going to banks. They probably didn't get it all through the rest of the economy, but they sold. What they did was they bought government bonds, but they tried to buy them off non-banks so that the money went into the economy around the side of banks. Of course, it went into someone's bank account in the end, but that's very different to giving money to banks. When we bailed out RBS and Lloyds and gave money to banks, taxpayers' money, we just did that in a normal way. We borrowed money as a society and gave it in return for owning those banks. And that's very, very different. And that wasn't done through QE at all. So the second thing is it's just the motivation for it is all wrong. Then there's 3 reasons I'm going to say quickly why it isn't actually that different, the people's quantitative easing isn't that different from what actually happened in quantitative easing, so it's wrong to say it's something radically new. One thing is about the practicalities of what you buy with money you create. So let's just say, what did QE do? Bank of England created money, it did it electronically, that's what a central bank can do, it has control over the money, the base money in an economy. That's the one thing it has a monopoly control over. It can sit there with a computer and say, right, that's £10, and we are going to use that £10 as the Bank of England to buy something with it. And by buying something with it, you get that £10 into the economy. So that's in both of these. PQE and QE, it's the same thing. And what did QE do? Well, it bought a bond issued by the government. So it bought government debt, which allowed the government actually, essentially, to spend money that it didn't otherwise have, and was very flexible, because the government could do whatever it liked with that money. It could spend it on infrastructure, it could spend it on benefits, it could spend it on the health service. It was a very, very flexible system. There was some sort of rules to dress it up, saying we're not going to buy newly minted government bonds, we're only going to buy second-hand government bonds, but essentially that just made the financing of Britain through the crisis rather easier than it otherwise would have been. PQE does basically the same. Bank of England creates money, it buys a bond by a thing called a National Infrastructure or Investment Bank. The National Investment Bank is directed, told by the central government what it needs to build, i.e. it's just like a government department being told by the Treasury what to build, and the government guarantees that bond with a government guarantee behind it. It's actually basically the same, but without the flexibility of ordinary lending. A fourth thing is rather complicated, is whether there's any additional, whether you get any additional bang for your buck by saying you're going to sort of concentrate this money on infrastructure rather than just buying government debt. I would argue that you have to think about what would happen. Oh, that's really interesting. There you go. I'll carry on. You have to think about what would happen otherwise. And I think it's perfectly reasonable to say that without QE, we would have found it much harder to finance our way through a very, very large deficit in the crisis and thereafter. We haven't had a peacetime deficit that large, and we had very little financing problems, partly because of QE. So it did actually allow the government to have an additionally loose fiscal policy without too much problem. And finally, there is a suggestion that people's QE is in some sense permanent, whereas ordinary QE is in some sense temporary, because at some point the Bank of England is going to sell all these bonds it now owns. Well, just the technicalities of that. Well, A, the Bank of England might well never sell the bonds it owns, because we might never find there's an opportune moment to do so, so whether this is temporary or permanent I think is a moot point. But equally, even if you say at the start that you're never ever going to sell these infrastructure bonds that you've bought off the National Infrastructure Bank, that doesn't, you cannot commit to doing that. That's not something that government now can commit a government 100 years later to do, because a government 100 years later, or even 5 years later, could always issue a lot of debt and not spend that money, and could just burn it. It's essentially just destroy the money. Just as you can create money, you can destroy money. So there is no way of credibly committing never to that one thing is permanent and one thing's temporary. So again, though they sound very different, they're not as different in total. Just as the final, the sixth point is, I think, the thing that annoyed me most about people's quantitative easing was the conflation of all of these things into one. So you had creating money, infrastructure, equality, not banks, all together, and you get this magic policy that suddenly solves these problems that we've had in Britain for years and not been able to solve. And it gives the impression that you as a potential government are not very serious, that you believe there's a magic money tree out there, which is just waiting for you to get into government, and then all problems are solved and no one has to pay for it. And I think Corbyn was very lucky that he was only running for Labour leadership, because if he'd been running for being PM, he'd have found it more difficult. But if he'd won, if Labour win with a policy of people's quantitative easing and then try and implement it, they're going to find it's not nearly as easy or simple as they promised, and they'll have all the sorts of problems that politicians often have when they promise something for nothing and then can't deliver it. So that's what I think is wrong with PQE. What are the serious issues that this sort of topic raises? I'm going to name two, which are really serious that we need to think about. One is how to stimulate an economy when you're in a slump, when you've already got extremely low interest rates. We haven't solved that. We might be going into another slump at some point. Quite a lot of people in the world think China might lead the global economy into a slump quite soon. And we don't have a good answer to that question, whether it is having very radically negative interest rates, so you're charged to hold any money, or whether you really just have to have outright money creation and a big fiscal stimulus. So you basically, what you say is, we are going to print money as a central bank or a society, because it's all society together rather than splitting monetary and fiscal policy, and we're going to print a load of money and we're going to give it to households so that they can spend, and that is going to be the stimulus. That, I think, will be essentially what we do. It's not that different, let's face it, to what Alistair Darling did in 2009 with his VAT cut. That was borrowing money at the same time as there was QE going on, and it was to lower the prices in shops so people were better off than they otherwise would be. He wanted to give money to everyone in their household, but technically that's not very easy to do in Britain very quickly, so that's why there was the VAT cut instead. So that's one big issue that we need an answer to before the next slump, preferably rather than in the crisis. And secondly is what infrastructure do we need in Britain? How much, where and what? And it's not an easy question. Is all infrastructure equal? Is it the same to be building HS2 as to be building a fence to stop migrants coming in Calais? They're both bits of UK infrastructure. They have very different returns, and society will have very different feelings about things. It's also easy to invest too much in infrastructure. If you go to Japan, you will know that you can see that wherever you go. So I think what I would say is you need to understand that Corbyn's PQE was basically a gimmick to help him get elected, a big new idea to help him get elected as Labour leader. Now he's got that job, I think they're rapidly moving away from it. It's being rapidly dropped, and I think that's a very good thing for Labour and for Jeremy Corbyn. But there are some big issues that we still have to resolve, particularly in how we address slums and how much and what sort of infrastructure we invest in Britain.
It struck me that a lot of the PQE discussion was more hype than substance. It was presented as some kind of panacea, and yet when you actually tried to distill down into what they were actually talking about, what emerged was a great deal of confusion. I am somewhat relieved to see that now the hype is dying down a little bit. We can now actually address the confusion. And that's essentially what I would like to try and do, because it seems to me that fundamentally, Chris's second point, which was that PQE attempted to bring together or confuse or conflate two quite different things, is the heart of the matter. The first is, what do you do when your economy is tanking? Yeah, we had in 2008 to 9 an exceedingly deep recession. We did all manner of very unconventional and strange things to try and get ourselves out of it, with varying degrees of success and with some rather unfortunate effects, which I'll come into in a minute. But there is also the question of what do we do in terms of management of our economy in the longer term. What sort of level of investment do we need? What is the role of government? And where we've ended up now is, I would have said, a fair degree of political gridlock around that. And that PQE was used perhaps wrongly by the Corbyn camp to try and address both issues, both the looking backwards issue about how do we deal with an economy that's tanking, particularly as we don't seem to be able to get interest rates off the floor, and the more long-term issue about what is the role of government in relation to its population, and in relation to investing for the future, with a view to improving productivity and creating jobs and generating growth for the future. It tried to bring both of those together in one policy, and to my mind it failed. And I want to talk about both briefly because they are important. Looking backwards for a minute into what's been done in the last 4 or 5 years in terms of extraordinary monetary measures to try and get the economy moving, I think we have done an immense amount with monetary policy and nowhere near enough with fiscal policy. We've relied an awful lot on QE, and one of the things that we know QE does is increase inequality, because it is buying assets off the rich. The strapline that says QE for the bankers is not right, except insofar as bankers tend to be rich. It certainly isn't QE for the banks. But QE for the rich, very definitely. The Bank of England itself in 2013 said that the assets they were buying were predominantly owned by the top 15% of households, and that and it was the holders of those assets who primarily benefited from QE. As a consequence, we have seen an increase in inequality, and we do potentially need to do something about that. PQE and its relatives, such as better known as helicopter money, is a way of getting money to households. As Chris said, it's not particularly easy to do that. It does have a longer distinguished pedigree. It's been suggested by all sorts of people from the Great Depression onwards that actually giving people money so they can spend it just might be a good way of digging you out of a slump. And by that, and generally speaking, it's better to give it to poorer people because they're more likely to spend it. There's a proper economic phrase for that, but I won't use it. We have countered that by saying, yes, but the problem is trying to recall the money, the problem is when things start to improve, is trying to undo the money, recall the money we've dished out. I regard that as a fairly specious argument, really, because we have such things as taxes and interest rates that are both ways of recalling money. So I kind of don't buy it. But that is one of the arguments that's used, and people go, oh my God, inflation, and oh my God, Zimbabwe, and if you suggest doing anything like that, I just think, oh, for goodness sake. You're in a slump. Inflation's the least of your worries. That's kind of not where we are now. But that's looking backwards at the kind of slump we had in 2008, 2009, instead actually giving people money might have been a better policy. So going forward, giving people money if we have that kind of slump again might be a good idea. And in that respect, I'd kind of give a qualified yes please to PQE, because I happen to think it's better in that respect than what we've come to regard now as bizarrely as conventional QE. But that's not what we need now. Well, the discussion now is about when we're going to raise interest rates, and about what we're going to do about investment spending, and about what the role of government is in the state. How big do we want government to be? Those are the discussions we're having now in the UK. And for me, therefore, the second part of this, which got mixed up with the first, is about the long-term investment in our economy, which we are dismal at, I have to say. We really are. The UK is shocking at investment, both the private sector and the public sector. The Standard & Poor's back in January came up with an analysis that said, you know, if the UK were to invest in infrastructure, particularly in transport, the fiscal multiplier effect was something like 2.5%. They analysed that on the basis of the length of time that people in the UK spend sitting in traffic jams, which they considered to be a huge drain on productivity. That was the highest multiplier in Europe, by the way. So if you were thinking that Greece would be better, you'd be wrong. It was an extraordinary piece of analysis. What I don't understand is why the Labour Party didn't seize the opportunity to say, look, very low interest rates, the lowest interest rates in history, are a signal from the markets that we can afford to borrow. We can lock in very low interest rates now for long periods of time and invest in transport and infrastructure and whatever else we decide. And I agree there is a debate needed about what exactly we invest in. But instead of which, we're squandering that opportunity. We're basically saying, no, we're not going to do it, we're not going to borrow. What we're going to do is we're going to go to China and get them to spend some money on our infrastructure instead. I don't know about you, but that doesn't strike me as a particularly sensible policy, particularly given that China itself seems to be going, actually, we're not too sure where we're going economically. So for me, I think that the Labour Party missed an opportunity to actually turn around on that one and say, we need to be investing now and we need to be doing it ourselves, not relying on foreign direct investment to do it. The government is squandering that opportunity and they need to be called out on it by Her Majesty's opposition. So my view would be that Her Majesty's opposition, which is now led by Jeremy Corbyn, should be doing its job. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is where I rest my case.
Thank you for the invite to speak. It's going to make for a slightly poor debate if I end up agreeing with a large amount of what's just been said on the panel. But let me start with a slightly different point, and perhaps the same place that Chris started, which is how pleased I was to also see the Post-Crash Economic Society here at Manchester and other similar groups set up at universities around the country. Not least of which, because it reminds me of being taught economics, being taught actually about central bank independence by someone who later went to sit on the Monetary Policy Committee, a very good lecturer, Charles B, and about the importance of central bank independence, and what you would have is a central bank that would be free of government control with a clear target for what he was trying to do, in this case control inflation, and it would have a simple lever that this independent body would pull up and down interest rates, and that would get you to your inflation target, and that way, because this would be a credible setup and everyone would trust this independent central bank, you'd end up with lower inflation. As a result, you wouldn't have this inclination of governments to think, oh, there's an election coming up, let's just jam down interest rates, stoke up a boom, and then we can win the election, because everyone feels at least temporarily somewhat better off, with the cost, of course, in the future of inflation. That was the theory. And it was drummed into our heads, and it was extremely confidently presented. It was presented as part of something at the time that got called the new consensus in macroeconomics. The belief, summarised by Gordon Brown, that we were in fact in a world of no return to boom and bust. That as Robert Lucas, who won the Nobel Prize in economics back in the day, put it, that the fundamental problems of depression prevention has been solved by economics, at least for decades to come, he says in 2003. And then, of course, promptly gets proved rather spectacularly wrong and invalid through 2007 into 2008. And it's the response to that, I think, that has motivated this interest in trying to understand why it was you had this extraordinary kind of self-confidence in economics and in a particular version of doing economics, and at the same time some thinking about alternatives. And that, I think, is the link between post-crash economics movement and societies and what's happened with people's QE. Because if you think about it, and I tend to take what I like to assume is a sort of vaguely democratic view of this, that economics should be something that people understand and think about and believe they can change. And that the economy is something that you should have a conversation about, and we need to have an engagement with how that economy functions in order that we can make it work better for people. An important part of what's happened around PQE is that something that is otherwise very esoteric, very obtuse, just sort of a thing that hangs around in the background, which is monetary policy. It's not necessarily something clear what's going on here, has been forced out into the open. And that, I think, is to the credit of this argument, and to the credit at least of raising the issue. However, and it is a big however, of course it's all very well saying let's have a conversation about economics, let's get lots of people involved. There is of course a problem if your conversation is disappearing down all sorts of rabbit holes and going in all kinds of slightly wacky, was the word used earlier, wacky directions, which is one of the issues you start to get with PQE. And I think the two best criticisms I heard or have heard of the idea that your central bank can kind of print money to make things happen, which fundamentally it can, but it's how you do it and under what circumstances you do it. I think the two best criticisms of this is the one that Chris raised at the end, which is this issue of you're offering a free lunch. You're saying there are in fact magic unicorns out there. We'll just go and find one. You're saying to people, we don't actually have to change anything fundamental. We can just do something very easy, very quick, completely harmless, cost-free, and off we go, and everything will be fine. And I think if you're serious about trying to change how this economy functions, one way or the other, and Chris again wrote a column about this, one way or the other, you have to be quite serious about changing who holds wealth, how they hold it, how they spend it. You have to be quite serious about how that wealth is distributed, where it's invested, which of course Francis touched on, and then what you do with it afterwards. And that isn't a free lunch for everybody. That isn't wave a magic wand and make things work much better than they are. I mean, there are some, I think, relatively easy wins out there that we aren't doing at the minute. But there is going to be a serious challenge here, which of course is the other interesting thing about PQE, that it starts to break open the idea that these big institutions, the central bank, the banking system more generally, finance more generally, are not something that floats free of everybody else, that make their own decisions, that are entirely without any public control or oversight, that just happens, that these are technocratic issues. It does start to drag it back down to the level of saying, well, are these institutions working in the best way possible? The second criticism, I think, of PQE touches on what Francis mentioned, and I think is it came up during the Labour leadership election, raised by Yvette Cooper, and it was quite sharp. She is an economist by background, I suppose. It was quite sharp, which was to say, look, this is just a version of the private finance initiative. All you're doing here is, instead of saying the government can go off and borrow money to invest, and I think broadly probably the panel would all agree that this isn't such a bad thing to do, And how you do it and where you do it is the question to ask. The government can go off and borrow money to invest, but instead of doing that, you're using this peculiar off-balance sheet mechanism and getting your central bank to do it. You're putting the liabilities involved on the central bank balance sheet rather than on the government balance sheet. And what is the difference between this and PFI, Private Finance Initiative? Cunning ruse, started actually by the previous Conservative government back at the end of the 90s, indulged into an enormous extent by the Labour government because it seems to offer you a nice way to invest without stoking up borrowing on the part of the government to an excessive degree, or presumed to be an excessive degree. Of course, the issue here is that if you have basically the lowest interest rates in history, you may as well just borrow to invest if that's what you want to do. There is no need to go all around the houses through your central bank to make this happen. But let's also pick up on where I think some of the criticisms around PQE get a little carried away with themselves. I mean, the first one, and the most obvious one, is talk about Zimbabwe, and various people who probably ought to know better have started flinging this around. The government's printing money and we're going to spend it. This is what happens in Zimbabwe. Well, yes, but it's also just what happens all the time anyway. How can the Bank of England create money? Not because it's the Bank of England and the central bank, it's a bank. Banks create money. This is fundamental to what they do. How does QE operate? Well, we've got our central bank through this peculiar off-balance sheet mechanism, the asset purchase facility, to go out and buy £375 billion worth or thereabouts of government bonds. These bonds are then owned indirectly, or rather are then owned by the asset purchase facility. This asset purchase facility holds onto those bonds. That level of QE is maintained. In other words, as those bonds mature, the APF, the asset purchase facility, simply replaces them with bonds of similar maturity. In other words, QE is actually an ongoing process. Now, one argument here is perhaps you might want to shift the balance of those bonds. Perhaps over time you might want to shift out of simply investing in government bonds and into investing in different types of assets that may be out there. And nor is it particularly unusual to say as part of this that if you have something like an investment bank, a public investment bank, it is not particularly unusual to say that this could be financed through this mechanism. If you look at what the European Central Bank is now doing with its own quantitative easing programme on a huge scale, operating since earlier this year, a chunk of the money it is creating is going into the European Investment Bank. Now, if it's good enough for the European Central Bank, there is at least a question about could and should something similar be enacted here. It's not the same as saying we ought to do it straight off, but it simply could be raised as something that could happen. And the talk about Zimbabwe and the rest of it fundamentally misses the point. If you're worried about government creating money, we've already created and printed a load of money. That's already happened. So that, I think, gets you into the space of where you want to talk about. Does it help if I wave my hands? Is it something like this? There you go. Right. So I'll carry on pacing up and down and see if it works. It gets you into the space of what you do want to talk about, which brings me back, of course, to those lectures some time ago now on the role of an independent central bank and what its mandate should be. We currently basically have a central bank that says its mandate is, as an independent body owned by the government, but independent of the government in the sense that the government can't directly set interest rates, will seek to hit an inflation target of 2%. You can look over the last, well, certainly since 2008, really for about 10 years, you can look over that period of time, you can draw a nice graph, and you can see precisely how often we've come within, spitting distance even of that 2% target and not actually hitting it directly. But we were a long, long way from the vision in 1997 that this fairly arbitrary 2% target is what we're going to have, and that will be robust forevermore. That what happens over 2007, 2008, 2009 is that this system clearly isn't functioning anymore. It is no good talking about this 2% target, and poor old Mark Carney has to write a letter every couple of months saying, and once again, we haven't hit our target, very sorry, and then just carry on as you were before. This is a mandate that isn't working. And if that isn't working, and then you've got a central bank at this point, because if it's not really hitting this target, and it's not clear it's ever going to, I mean, look what's happened with interest rates. There's a peculiar little game that kicks in here, of course, that ever since 2009, interest rates are always going to be going up in, 6 months' time. And we've been saying this since 2009. So there's a peculiar little game that we've got into here, that if we have a central bank that is operating really without its mandate, it's just doing its thing, and it's not clear what that thing should be, there ought to be a public conversation about how that mandate could operate, which was pleased, I think, to see John McDonnell, who is now the Shadow Chancellor, not so much talking about people's QE, but talking about how we could think about using a central bank, redefining its mandate, maybe saying not just inflation, but a mandate to look at growth, perhaps even nominal GDP. Some other wider set of targets could be thrown into the mix of thinking how, after the crash, with the old systems, with the old ideas about how those systems should function, clearly no longer working, you can get into a useful place of thinking, how could that mandate change? And if an argument about PQE has got us to the point that large numbers of people are now considering what it means to have a central bank and how that central bank could operate, then the debate around PQE, for all the issues and problems involved in the proposal itself, I think has done us all a great service. Thank you.
I'd like now to start a panel discussion. Can the people at the back hear us okay, or should we use the mics? Is the volume? It's all right. Okay.
I think we need to be a little bit careful about talking about inequality and QE generally, and specifically need to be very careful about saying that it raised inequality. One, because inequality hasn't gone up in the UK. Income inequality has been very, very stable for the last 35 years. Well, no.
Because you're arguing with Piketty, you seem to...
There'll be time for questions.
I'm very happy to talk about that. I'm extremely happy to talk about that. I like talking about that. But I was talking. That's about wealth inequality. Here we were talking about income inequality. The Bank of England paper was about income inequality, not wealth inequality. But income inequality hasn't risen since the early 90s. It rose a huge amount in the late 80s. I'm not saying that inequality has never risen in the UK. It rose an enormous amount in the late 80s. It has been stable since. But the bigger point is that what you have to think about with QE is what would have happened had you not done it. And if Britain had been in a much deeper slump and not come out of the slump at all, that would have been a hell of a lot worse for the poor than a policy that essentially lowered interest rates, and because rich people tend to own assets which are interest rate sensitive, that made them richer than they otherwise were. So the counterfactual there is actually really important. There's one thing on what James said about Zimbabwe. It's clearly a question of degree. About if you are doing what the ECB does in where they need QE to invest a little bit of money, only a tiny bit of their money in the European Investment Bank, there's no problem with that whatsoever. If at all times you create money to spend on infrastructure, you are doing exactly what Zimbabwe says. So the question is degree and timing.
Okay. Would anyone like to respond?
Yeah, a couple of things. I'm actually talking about wealth, not income.
Well, then wealth inequality hasn't risen either.
Okay. I'm quoting the Bank of England, which did say that the benefits from QE had primarily accrued to the rich.
Yeah, but the same paper also made the counterfactual point that I made, and that was the main point of that paper. They put that in as a bit of a sop.
But that's not the only counterfactual here, is it?
not
Because
the-
the argument
exactly.
is the effectiveness. Would there have been a way to do QE that lessens the inequality effect but still got you to where you wanted to be in
Do
avoiding
you
slump?
think, but the question then is, the reason rich people who hold assets which are interest rate sensitive did well was because interest rates came down, so house prices and financial inequities and bonds went up in price. I can't see of a QE that would not have kept interest rates low and had that effect. Can you?
You can keep interest rates low.
Yes, we
and
can.
you, yeah,
Yes,
cool.
but I think that the two are separate. That the Bank of England giving
Well,
a
in
guideline
bonds,
policy rates can be done without QE. I think one of the difficult things actually in terms of what was done after the financial crisis is to separate out the effects of interest rate policy from QE, and it's actually quite hard to separate those two out. So, for example, some people in the Savers lobby argue that the QE has been immensely destructive to their pensions. But when you actually look at it, you say, well, actually, your real problem is low interest rates, really, not QE per se. So I think we have to be a little bit careful about actually, it's quite hard to separate out the effects of the different bits. of monetary policy. And I take your counterfactual point, Chris, but I said there is also one that James made, which is that it's all very well saying, well, QE, Douglas said, it did actually prevent the slump being as bad as it might otherwise have been. I would be the first to agree with that the first round of QE, particularly after the failure of RBS, when asset prices were in freefall, I think did arrest what could have been a very nasty deflationary spiral. That is not to say that there might not have been other things that could have been better, even with the first round of QE. But my stronger argument would be that the second round, started in 2012, and in particular the second and third rounds of Fed QE, which we haven't talked about, actually were the wrong policy, and we should have been looking at something more directly applied to people on low and middle incomes. Myself.
Just to pick up on that, I mean, the issue here is, do you simply need to be applying government bonds? There is no reason that I can see that you should particularly favour government bonds over other kinds of assets. The reason usually given is that this should have a reduced inflationary impact because it should be possible to unwind things rather more easily than if you have invested in something else out there. Chris touched on this. But if you've got to the point that it is not clear at all when you will unwind QE, when you will actually get rid of these bonds held by the government in a slightly peculiar arrangement at this point, then it's not clear at all what difference there would be between simply saying we will invest in something that isn't a government bond that is harder to unwind compared to a government bond that we're not ever going to unwind. And I think, as Adair Turner pointed out, Japan has done QE for a long period of time. It has an immense government debt. It is probably getting to the point where it's simply going to say, we will not unwind this QE, which is the same as just writing the debt off, in fact. That you've monetised the thing and that's that. Now, if we've got to that point, and it's not at all clear when we will unwind QE, because it's not at all clear when we'll get back to anything like the so-called normal world, this is potentially the new normal, then why not save on the extent of this QE that you've done, £375 billion, and instead invest in something that, as Francis says, has a more direct impact on, in particular, those lower down the income scale and has a more direct impact on the kind of infrastructure investment we want to do. I mean, the last government did, in response to the crash, bring forward a whole load of infrastructure investment. That government capital spending shot up as a share of GDP, obviously GDP's falling, shot up as a share of GDP over 2009, and then probably the worst single thing that George Osborne did, at least in those economics terms, is to try and hack away at that as soon as he arrived in office, and then sort of try and run back again to catch up with where he was thereafter. That if we do have to do this again, it would make sense to bring forward infrastructure investment and to do so through a QE type arrangement, if it is not possible that we can use some other form of monetary policy. And if you've got rates of 0.5%, it's going to be very, very hard to do conventional monetary policy.
Speaking about interest rates, I wanted to ask the panel what their view is of the Bank of England using negative interest rates to stimulate growth, which Andy Haldane, the chief economist of the Bank of England, has suggested.
I think you can use negative. The ECB's got a negative deposit rate. Scandinavian countries have got quite substantially negative interest rates. So there's nothing technically impossible about having a negative interest rate, particularly but what in the end, if it really applies to the public, it means that you have a charge on your bank account. The money you hold in your bank, you have to pay a charge for, which essentially is your negative interest rate, which gives you some incentive to go out and spend it. It also gives you an incentive, if the negative interest rate is very significant, to go and put your money under your mattress, to turn it into a cash form which has no interest rate, and that is the technical limit to which you can have negative interest rates. That's why people don't think you can have them very negative without. For example, you could get a nice trade if you were an investment bank with a very secure vault. It would be to turn a lot of money into cash and then take it back a year or two later and make a nice return on it, which would be not good for anyone. So there are some natural limits. So like Andy Haldane said, to get round the natural limits, he was exploring possibility. He said essentially what you'd have to do would be to ban paper money. Because if you take that action, then everyone has to have money in some form of electronic form that is traceable, and you can apply your negative interest rate to. My feeling on that was a step too far, certainly in civil liberties terms, and we wouldn't want to go down
Now, I have a few things to add to that, actually, because looking at negative rates for quite some time, I started looking at them in about 2012, and concluded that they actually could have some very untoward effects. First of all, we kind of assume that there's kind of sort of hydraulic monetary policy, that if you cut interest rates below zero, then that's expansionary, isn't it? Duh. And I look at the effects that it has on, and think, where I come from, anything that's tax, which a negative interest rate fundamentally is, you have to start from the premise that it's actually contractionary, and then try and explain how it's expansionary. So I start from the premise that given that negative interest rate is fundamentally a tax on the holding of money, so it's a tax on money, yeah? How you justify that in terms of expansion, and the argument has to be that it's essentially a proving effect, that people are discouraged from holding money, so you would increase the velocity of money. I wonder how long it would take the private sector to come up with some alternative ways of holding money that didn't incur the negative interest rate, for starters. I also wonder what the incentive would be on banks simply to, rather than pass on the negative rate to their funders, their depositors, their wholesale funders, their bondholders, to raise rates to borrowers. Credit Suisse actually did exactly that in January in response to what is quite a small negative deposit rate by the ECB at the moment. I mean, it's only, is it 25 basis points or something negative? And yeah, Credit Suisse is saying already need to put up mortgage rates because of it. Because the fact is that if the bank considers that it's not able to pass on the negative rate to its funders, then the bank experiences a squeeze on margins. Now, we have some pretty damaged banks out there even now. I'm not convinced that squeezing market margins is a particularly stunningly good way of doing expansionary monetary policy when you've got some damaged banks. It doesn't strike me as horrendously sensible. The whole negative rate debate seems to be quite confused because the first countries to implement negative rates actually were Switzerland and Denmark, and they did so not because they wanted to expand monetary policy, but because they wanted to tighten it. And that was because the ECB was cutting rates at the time. They were experiencing capital flight from the distressed Eurozone countries, particularly Switzerland, and they cut interest rates below zero in order to discourage inflows of capital, which again rather supports my argument that negative rates are actually contractionary. I'm yet to be convinced that negative rates would serve any particularly useful purpose. I would rather that we got out of the political gridlock that we got ourselves into, that basically says that governments aren't allowed to spend any money, and stop worrying about debt to GDP ratios and deficit rate to GDP ratios, which are subject to constant revisions and are pretty nearly meaningless when interest rates are very low anyway. And for goodness sake, to spend some money and get ourselves out of this, rather than tinkering with monetary policy that's getting close to its limits of usefulness and has real social costs.
I very largely agree with that. I think it's an interesting, I mean, Andy Holding's speech is interesting. It has a whole load of different proposals in there and a rather bleak view of the future, at least over the next few years, but it's well worth the read. I'd only add to the issue of this hydraulic view of interest rates. If you cut them, this makes people spend more. That's basically the relationship you're getting at here. If you keep on cutting them below zero, that relationship will still hold. May not hold. In addition, I think, to the points Francis has raised, there seems to be, and I'm just sort of thinking about this, at least a potential for this impact on people's major form of saving, which is their pension. And if you think your pension's not going to be worth very much, rather than spending money now, because you've got negative interest rates, you just frantically stuff everything into your pension, because you want, in the future, to be able to draw down on that thing. So that could easily produce a fairly perverse consequence there. The other bit is just the kind of practicalities. I mean, if anyone here has been to prison, I won't ask you to put your hands up, but it's quite clear that if you stop people using money, they rapidly go off and find something a bit like money to use instead. Very, very soon go and do that. And if they don't want to use money because of negative interest rates, or you try and block them doing this, they'll just toot off and find something else to use that's a bit like money, probably isn't as good as actual money, but basically will substitute for it. So there's a more practical end here, and then I think an unconsidered behavioural impact that suggests that this isn't really going to be quite the useful device it might first appear to be.
Okay. I'd like to go back to the point that James made during his speech about if, I think, was it John McDonnell talked about redefining the Bank of England's mandate. So let's, well, hypothetically say if Labour got in and they wanted to do this, and maybe also PPQE as well, would this threaten the Bank of England's independence, and if so, is that a bad thing?
If Labour changed the mandate, no, it absolutely doesn't threaten the Bank of England's independence. That is part and parcel of the way we operate the Bank of England's independence in this country. I don't have a problem, particularly if you do threaten the Bank of England's independence. I think if you have good reasons to do so. But the way we do it here is that the government every year gives the Bank of England a mandate, and the government can change that mandate. And it has changed that mandate a few times, not in a very major way since in 1997, but there wouldn't be there's no constitutional issue if you went and changed it to having a growth target as well as an inflation target or a nominal GDP. That's just a complete red herring. I'm not sure how much difference it would make, however. I was very tempted by particularly nominal GDP targets in 2011, 2012, when I thought the Bank of England was making a mistake by focusing too much on inflation and not on what was happening to the nominal side of our economy. And I thought we should have more monetary expansion. But then they went and did it anyway. So they did actually, even though inflation was well above their target, they did actually go and expand in the way that I was keen that they did. So I didn't feel that in the end the mandate was constraining action. And if you think about the things that John McDonnell so far has talked about, either a Fed-style dual mandate, so including employment and inflation, well, in the UK we've got the highest employment rate on record at the moment. So if anything, that would give hawks on the MPC more of a reason to tighten than just inflation alone. So you know, be careful what you wish for. Sometimes I would say. And secondly, I think a big test of alternative mandates is, would it have helped us in the crisis, in the years running up to the crisis? And unfortunately, with nominal GDP and with employment, I think the answer to that is no. Nominal GDP was running at basically 5% a year. It was incredibly stable, and it would have just reinforced the view that everything was fine, just like inflation reinforced the view that everything was fine. And employment was very stable and growing, as an employment rate was growing very steadily, but very small amounts. And again, that would have reinforced the view that we had found a new nirvana of the economy. It was the new normal, but a good one, as James was saying. And so I don't think either of those would have led us to be worried about the economy in a way we weren't anyway.
I want to sort of open it up a bit, sort of following on from what Chris said about the Bank of England's mandate. In the UK, the Bank of England's mandate is set by the government anyway. We have instrumental independence here, and they can change it. So if the government decided that a 4% inflation target was more appropriate than a 2% one, which has been suggested, they could do it if they chose. They don't, but they could. So when if a future Labour government seriously wanted to do PQE, they could insist that the Bank of England did it. It doesn't really change anything. I want to open it up a bit more, though, which is to consider the whole sort of question of Bank of England independence in the light of fiscal policy, because normally what we're trying to do with Bank of England, with independence of the central bank, is to create some kind of distance between what we might call the political cycle, and the conduct of monetary policy, the conditions in the economy. And yet I've noticed with some disturbance, I have to say, a tendency this government's particularly done it, to expect that a central bank will offset political decisions that have economic consequences. So, for example, we elect an austerity-minded government whose Chancellor then sets out his stall at a Mansion House dinner in which he says we're going to have fiscal consolidation, balanced by monetary activism. Now, to my mind, that is actually telling the Bank of England how it should conduct monetary policy in the light of the plans of the government. And that is not monetary independence, that is fiscal dominance. After all, if it was the other way around, if it was a government intent upon highly expansionary fiscal policy and telling the Bank of England to basically monetise the debt so it could do it, we'd all be screaming in Zimbabwe, and that is essentially the PQE argument. My point is that we already have it, just in a different guise.
Yeah, on that, I mean, I think it's absolutely right what's been said so far. I just wanted to pick up on the NGDP in particular, which has a sort of appeal, and it seems to be getting talked about a bit, talked around quite a lot. I mean, Mark Carney floated it before he became Bank of England governor when he was in Canada, as a potential way of solving what seem to be lots and lots of fairly difficult issues for just an inflation targeting, not least of which is this kind of keeping some eyes on what's happening to growth and combining those things in a nominal GDP target, at least in theory, should do that. The two issues, I suppose, are one is a measurement issue. This is something that Milton Friedman point, but it's a measurement issue. We don't measure GDP very frequently, and we don't measure it necessarily very well. I mean, you have to adjust the thing afterwards. So that is a problem if this is your target and you're attempting to chase after the thing, and therefore setting interest rates now on the basis of a target which is some distance in the past and subject to significant corrections in a way that inflation just isn't. I mean, there are issues with inflation measurement, certainly around the inequality impact of inflation is striking. The poorer you are, generally speaking, the higher the rate of inflation you face relative to the headline measure. So there are issues around that, but they're not the same as this past issue measurement of GDP. You could in theory solve it, but nonetheless it strikes me that's an in theory solution rather than something you can do straight away. The other one is a more broader problem, which is like, okay, it's fine to say let's have a central bank that does that. You're kind of overstating its importance at this point. What is the link between what a central bank does and an impact on growth? There clearly is one of some sort, but it's not quite as simple as pull a lever and something will happen. I mean, none of it's quite as simple as pull a lever and something will happen. But that overstatement of what you can do with a central bank does get us back into kind of PQE land, or the kind of the more crude versions of PQE, where you go, we have this big thing, it is important, it's called a central bank. Let's use it to just kind of solve everything else out there. Which you can't do. You can't do because the link between what the central bank is doing and the range of different tools it has and what happens in the rest of the economy isn't as clear as simply pull a lever and it happens. It looks a bit like that, but it fairly obviously isn't. And the link between what the central bank does and growth in particular, I think, is much less simple than NGDP targeting or growth targets alone would get you to. There may also be a specific issue here, which perhaps is already creeping up on the Bank of England we have, which is that there's already quite a lot of demands placed in this institution now. It's got a bigger range of things it needs to be looking at since the crash. This is something that's getting towards potentially a bit of an overstretch already, and that's simply layering on more and more without thinking about how you resource this, or the bigger kind of design of your monetary policy system is something that, again, it's too easy. You change the mandate, you can do that straight away. The Bank of England's competence to implement that mandate and to take on a range of different things is another separate question that you need to think about.
Great. I'd just like to ask one more quick question about the possible effects that a policy like people's QE could have on the currency. Would it cause a devaluation like ordinary QE did as well?
I think I'll be very brief. It depends. It depends how much and when. And those without knowing specifics, I know it's a boring answer, but without knowing specifics about size and timing, you can't actually give a very sensible answer.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, the links between domestic monetary policy and what's going on in the world are, again, not entirely obvious at times, because after all, other countries do monetary policy too. And so whether or not your monetary reflation of your economy, whether it's ordinary QE or some other form of QE or interest rate policy or whatever it is, results in devaluation rather depends on what other people are doing. Yeah.
I suppose it was the point of your question that some rather silly people have said, oh, the pound would slump and it would make our country a disaster zone. Well, I think the answer to that is no, but because it depends on timing and size, and as Francis said, what other countries do at the same time.
It also has the other side of that, which is also the people who say, well, what we need to do is devalue our currency so we get lots of exports, and that doesn't necessarily follow either, particularly with a country like the UK, where we're kind of doing intermediate goods, and so we actually get what we gain on exports, we tend to lose on imports. We end up kind of caught in the middle with this devalued currency and no great rate gain in terms of our trade balance. You can talk about that. You know more about that than I do.
Okay. This is not a debate at all, is it? I just agree with you.
we're just still having a nice
nice.
It's like a tea party. It's great.
What would I say on that? Well, yeah, no, it does depend on what other people do. I mean, it does. The implicit behind the question, I suppose, is should we think about having any kind of target for the exchange rate? Is that even a sensible way to approach this issue? It's happened in the past. What seems to have happened over the last few years is we kind of got a bit. He said like this, we have a kind of implicit target for the exchange rate, which is somewhat below what it was, because that's what's happened, and the Bank of England's taken no particular action to prevent what's been a fairly substantial devaluation since 2008 or thereabouts, with some picking up over the last year or so. That devaluation, by the way, for anybody who gets very excited about devaluation resolving lots of other problems, really hasn't made very much difference to our current account deficit at all, which has over this year reached record levels and then closed somewhat surprisingly just in the last quarter that we have numbers for, largely due to an inflow of, or rather changes in the flows of non-monetary gold, it would appear. So in other words, what you've got with this economy in general is a whole series of issues that if you wanted or minded to tackle them, things around productivity and investment and perhaps inequality, although I'm sure we can debate that a bit more than everything else we've managed to not debate. That if you have a whole series of issues like this, all of them are much more complex than any kind of push-button simple solution would suggest, which is a hard thing to sell, I suspect, in political terms. It's a hard thing to go as a political party and go into an election and say, look, everything's actually really quite difficult, and this is going to require some hard choices of one form or another if we're going to try and get anything out of this. There are no free lunches, there are no magic unicorns, there's certainly no magic money tree out there to make everything all right for everybody.
Okay, I think we're going to open up questions to the floor now. Would it be all right to take 3 questions at a time? Is that fine with everyone? Yeah, I'm going to take that one.
Might actually get some disagreement now. This could be.
Yeah. Does anyone have any questions? The gentleman at the back. Thanks.
It's all right, I don't need the microphone.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, you first, and then you.
Yeah, you were just mentioning.
You were mentioning the devaluation of our currency in the period after 2008, when initially there was a really strong climb from, I want to say, 97 to 2007, when we were perceived as a safe haven. But wouldn't it be more of a depreciation, because the Bank of England doesn't exactly interfere in our exchange rate mechanism anymore the way that they used to back when we were in ERM2, before Black Wednesday?
Yes, if you want to be particularly pedantic about it. Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right. That is a better word to use, but the effect is very similar.
We cut interest rates and the pounds fell because we cut interest rates. I mean, you can call that depreciation if you want. We weren't deliberately, in that sense, trying to cut the exchange rate or manage the exchange rate in the way that we did when we were part of the exchange rate mechanism. But I don't think there's any doubt that the intention was at least partly to influence the level of the pound.
Yeah, another question.
Hi, very good talk on what you, very interesting. I particularly wanted to come on to what was being said about what has been referenced. The critique of people's QE is that it can often supposedly lead to an increase in the money supply, which would lead to inflation. So would it therefore follow that we should curb private banks' ability to increase the money supply through, for example, fractional reserve banking, where banks, through loaning money, can literally create money and cause inflation, and this isn't regulated at all. So if we're going to regulate the Bank of England's ability to create money, should we therefore regulate more the private bank's ability to create money?
Do you want to take a few?
Oh yeah, should we take another 2 questions, please? Gentleman here.
Thanks. I just wanted to ask, we thought that we could effectively manage the economy through interest rates. Obviously that didn't work, and the fact that we needed to use QE. If QE becomes a norm, then what happens if we hit a crisis so severe that QE doesn't work anymore?
One more question, anyone?
Just like an engineer is a protected title in Germany, should economists be a protected title in this country so that we can recognise when people are talking about the economic system and when they're talking about the rentier system?
Francis, why don't you take
I knew I'd get that. Okay, I guess this is my subject really, isn't it? Private banks and creating money. We could talk all night about this one. I don't think it's entirely correct to say that we don't regulate the ability of private banks to create money. Ever since the financial crisis, oh boy, have we regulated the ability of private banks to create money. Not only that, but they've regulated it themselves too. So the problem with the creation of money by private banks is it's pro-cyclical. So in boom times they create loads because everybody likes to borrow and the good times will never end, and then it all comes crashing down, and then after that they don't want to lend and nobody wants to borrow, and so we end up with not enough money around. The job of monetary policy is to lean against that to some extent, but now that we recognise that monetary policy actually doesn't lean against that particularly well, we're adding additional tools to it. We're adding macroprudential tools and microprudential tools which are intended to specifically influence macroprudential tools against the tendency of the system as a whole to kind of be pro-cyclical, and microprudential to deal with the behaviour of individual banks. I'm not myself very keen on the idea of tinkering with this too much. I know there are proposals about stripping private banks of the ability to create money and all the rest of it, and I find myself thinking, I don't think, I've yet to see a proposal for removing the ability of private banks to create money that actually doesn't have very untoward consequences for the economy, such as seriously reducing its ability to allocate capital efficiently and support investment. You might argue that private banks don't do that particularly well, but they do it a whole lot better than they would if they just were constrained as to the amount of money they could lend by having to pre-fund all the time everything they ever did at the central bank. I think, it's one of these kind of, it's not a good system, but the alternatives are worse situations for me, I would have to say. We do need to recognise, though, that bank lending does create inflation, and not always in the places that we traditionally expect inflation to be. So one of the problems, one of the issues we haven't sorted out yet, is how we identify asset price inflation and what we do about it. We haven't really sorted that out yet, to my mind.
Chris wanted
I don't know.
I'm looking at you,
QE,
Chris.
what do we do in the crisis? I don't want to add any more, but I don't disagree with the word of that, I think. QE, if you had a crisis so severe, I think that's actually one of the things that we were talking, all of us were talking about quite a bit, is what do you do? And if I had to say what the consensus on the panel would be, we all were slightly wary about negative interest rates, and we all think the best thing you could do, which is I would say, is sort of what Alistair Darling did do at the teeth of the crisis late 2008, is you cut taxes in the most egalitarian way possible, which you could do quickly, and you fund that through central bank printed money in some form, which is called helicopter money, but in practical terms in the UK, if we don't think about it in advance, it generally will mean a VAT cut, because it's very we don't have any register of households, so we can actually literally send a cheque to land on everyone's door. We just don't have that in the UK. And when the government the Labour government asked about what you can do quickly and to get money to everyone, they were told it would take 9 months to actually get the money to people. So it's only a practical problem. If you could do a single cheque to each household where everyone would get the same amount of money, that's obviously the best way of doing it. It's sort of difficult. So VAT is something you can do very, very quickly, and I think that's what we would do unless we think about it in advance, which is of course why you should think about it in advance. I'm not entirely sure what you mean by having protected title like engineers in...
Well, like a doctor, you can't say you're a doctor
unless you have some sort of qualification.
As a doctor.
Well, I would worry about that. I would probably pass that test, seeing as I have a master's degree in economics, so I probably would be allowed to call myself an economist, but I think that would be giving far too much weight to sort of credentialisms or rather than the power of people's ideas. Now, there are people who talk, frankly, a load of nonsense out there, but I think they should be exposed for the nonsense they talk through the power of argument rather than through the power of credentials.
Well, I can add to that I would not qualify as an economist, because I actually have an MBA, not a master's.
I didn't say how, it's whether, like a doctor, you can... Then she took her clothes off, and I'm a doctor of divinity. It's not how you get that qualification, but it should be. There should be some.
I don't think that you can have a sensible accreditation system for economists, whereby if you've got this tick against you, you'd be able to say things, and if you didn't, you wouldn't. Because this comes to the root of democracy, where everyone should be able to have a view about these matters.
Not only that, but I mean, having a qualification in something like economics, which is to some degree subjective and behavioural anyway, is no guarantee that you'll talk sense. There are some people who are unquestionably economists out there who talk the biggest load of drivel. and people like me who aren't economists are always taking them apart about it.
Would it not have the effect of, for the public at least, one of them, I don't have to pass an exam. So I'm thinking more of talking about debate and whether we should have more national debate and open debate. It's so easy for people to comment on the rentier system and say it's economics, whereas we've heard a lot, especially from America with the protests, I quite like my favourite placard was 5 minus 2 equals 7. Because we're hearing that argument all the time, cut for growth.
But there are some economists who are proposing exactly that. I mean, the whole concept of expansionary fiscal austerity was proposed by an economist, somebody who had a PhD in economics. I don't think that saying, right, I'm an economist, I suspect it tends to close down debate and exclude people who don't fulfill that criterion, and thereby exclude some people who have really important and valid things to say.
Well,
I don't disagree, but I think that the economics, I'd like to think, could be somehow separated from the politics. A bit like a recipe, the ingredients are somehow separated from the method.
Unfortunately, I actually disagree with you there. I mean, the whole foundation of economics, if you go back to Adam Smith, is political economy. That that it's sort of the root of economics in human behaviour, really. And I don't think that
Well,
you
I
can separate
agree with
out
you, but how do
economics
we
and
have a
politics
debate
like that.
if we don't have a common language?
No, I think you can split. I think you can split facts
Yeah.
from argument. I think that's the distinction that needs to be made. But there are certain things that are just true or false,
And then we
things
get
that are big or
philosophy
small.
as well.
Is it all right if we move on to another question now? Have all the three
Well,
questions? Or you just want to...
yeah, just maybe not on that, but no. No, actually, because it does. I don't want to spend too long on it because I think it's covered. But there is like a philosophical issue here, right, which is raised by the post-crash society and that sort of thing. That if you had a system of accreditation for economists, given what is taught in most universities and places that do economics, that would produce a very definite class of people who are called economists, who would argue in a very definite way, and would say a set of things that perhaps you wouldn't actually agree with, for instance, right? And that would give them a sort of spurious advantage relative to anybody else who's not saying this. And it gets to the heart of the issue here, that we're dealing with a social science, not something like engineering. I don't want to disrespect engineers, but I think it's probably about one way to make a bridge so it doesn't fall down. And there's not that much debate about it, right? There's not the same when you're dealing with human society.
But we
There's
still
a
have
continual round.
homeopathy with
Yeah.
a huge medical school down the road.
So I think it's basically it's a dangerous proposal, is what I'm saying here, right? It's because you'll close down the post-crash economic society, for instance. So on the private banking, look, I'll be really quick about this. Look, I basically agree with Francis. I think I would add to the issue of saying let's just control the ability of private banks to create money. By the way, this is a really old debate. I mean, if you drag out like the banking versus currency schools from the 1840s or thereabouts, I mean, that's when the thing really sort of kicks off, and it goes round and round and round every time somebody realises there might be an issue with how money is being used. So it's not
Every time there's a banking crisis.
every time there's a banking crisis.
And
Yeah,
you're
this is
not
sort of where it
regularity.
comes in. So there's a continual debate about the thing. I think the issue we've got in Britain is not so much the fact that private banks create money. I mean, this is just what banks do. It's more how those banks are structured. And the fact that we have a few very, very large banks indeed, very centralised banking system, it produces other impacts that are not particularly desirable, like, for instance, excessive lending into mortgages and this sort of thing. And there might be ways to restructure and perhaps change the ownership of that system that would get you to better economic outcomes. Britain's an outlier in this relative to most developed countries, which have a broader range of different banking institutions.
Okay. We've just got time for another few questions, so does anyone have any? Yes.
Thanks, Giles. I'd be interested to get your views about dependence in another sense. You talked about monetary and fiscal independence. But what about living in a globalised world and whether it be either tacit approval with UK monetary policy with international powers, or maybe just their hands are being forced one way or the other? I could give an example of like the dance with the US Fed as one example.
Any of us? No? Okay. Sure. Answer.
Well, let's take the Fed issue face on. Mark Carney, Bank of England governor, says, and he said it about 4 times now, that there is no way that he's looking really at the Fed. They're looking at the situation for the UK economy, and they're taking a purely UK decision. Frankly, that is complete specious nonsense. They are looking very, very closely at what the Fed does. And if the Fed goes in December, it's raises interest rates a tiny bit in December, then it's much, much more likely that the Bank of England will do something in February or in May next year. Nothing there, but we're not going to get a big rise in interest rates anywhere anytime soon. You have to, and they certainly don't want to appear. So when I say that, it makes the Bank of England sound powerless, that they're just slavishly following the Fed, which equally isn't quite right. But you do have to take your decisions in a globalised context, because money flows around the world very, very fast. And one of the problems with the UK as a relatively, well, it's still a large economy, but a relatively small economy compared with very, very large economies, is that if we were moving alone with our interest rates, we could get some very big money flows, which might then be counterproductive and be much bigger because they're on their own. So you might get a massive inflow of money, sterling rises, so you get a much bigger tightening of monetary conditions than you actually wanted. So you've got to be really quite careful about that, and that's why when Mark Carty doesn't want to appear powerless. He says it's all up to us and we're not taking anyone else's decisions into account, and that's just not true. And there's good reasons why it's not true.
Yeah, I would agree with that. In actual fact, the Fed does that too. They talk an awful lot about domestic conditions, but then you actually read the FOMC minutes, and it turns out that they're looking at China. That was September's FOMC minutes, very, very clear the reason they didn't do the widely predicted hike in interest rates was because of concerns about what was happening in the Far East. Rightly, but there is another aspect of this as well, which we haven't touched on, which is the fact the impact of our earlier monetary policy decisions on the rest of the world, and particularly the QE, the Fed, Bank of England, the Swiss National Bank, which is one that hasn't been talked about, Japan, and latterly the ECB. All of those are creating money, and there is creation in the form of bank reserves, but it's also created in the form of deposits, which then flows somewhere else. And we do know that QE money often doesn't stay in the domestic economy, it flows somewhere else. And then, because it's money that doesn't really want to be somewhere else, it has a tendency to flow back again at the drop of a hat, which I think is actually quite unstable. And it's an aspect of unconventional monetary policy that we haven't really thought through. But I suspect our chickens are just beginning to come home to roost on that one.
Just on that is, yeah, I mean, partly the effects of previous rounds of QE, it's been quite dramatic in its immediate market impact. I think you can see that this is the other kind of lack of independence you have. You cannot actually read what financial markets are doing at any given point in time. It's an obvious constraint. We can see it over the summer. We appear to be getting to kind of a weird game of chicken, in particular between the Fed and markets in general, about whether they're going to put up interest rates or not. Why is there a great big panic about China in other stock markets? Well, it's really a panic about whether interest rates go up or not over any sort of time soon. Suggests, by the way, it may well not go up in December, even by a very small amount, although there's a kind of necessary signalling effect, I suppose, that has to take place at some point. So there's that kind of independence there. But there's also the other part of what Francis was saying, which is the issue of hot money and very rapid capital movements and the rest of it. And I think that the consensus is starting to shift back in favour of saying that completely liberalised financial and capital flows are not, in fact, the best possible way of running an entire sort of international monetary system, international financial system. That there is, and there are, good arguments for capital controls, particularly at moments of crisis, and at points where there are very severe strains being put on, particularly small economies. There is an argument for saying that you have to stop and restrict the ability of this form of capital flow taking place with its destabilising impact. Now that is getting quite some distance out of the sort of 2000s globalisation is everything, just get rid of all barriers to trade, all barriers to capital movement. I think we're seeing quite a shift in how people are thinking about these issues relative to the pre-crisis norm.
Yeah.
And we just have time for one more quick question, if anyone who hasn't asked one before. The lady over here.
Sorry, sort of a side note to something that you all mentioned in your speeches was that one thing you agreed about was that we do need some infrastructure investment, but PPP isn't the way to go. I just thought if you could maybe give your comments on the debate surrounding infrastructure investment, tying it to the devolution that we're seeing by the current government to local councils. Obviously, you know, they're not using it for that, they're using it as a cover for austerity. But could that possibly provide an opportunity, and if so, is that a positive opportunity, or should we sort of go back to the old, you know, central bank control of all infrastructure projects?
I think it depends what for. So local councils, there's some infrastructure can clearly be done by local authorities. So the two bits of infrastructure I would say, just off the top of my head, are housing and some local transport links, where both have a revenue stream, a very clear revenue stream from the users of those services. So the people who are housed in some form of housing, whether it's social housing or at a market rent, but there is a revenue stream which can pay for the financing. And equally with transport. Transport's slightly more tricky because the revenue stream probably won't pay for the full cost, and there needs a subsidy in element there too. Now devolution I think really does help, is potentially very good on the housing side of things, because if you allow local authorities to take more responsibility and borrow in a devolved way, then you are beginning to to get it to a situation where we might finally get some better housing policies through. There is, of course, underlying this, which is why the Treasury are always nervous about this, is what is the backstop? So what happens if you have a local authority that makes a right hash of it? And there will be. This will happen. That some local authority will make a right mess of it and will essentially go bust. And in this country, we're not very good at dealing with public sector entities that go bust because we normally bail them out from the Treasury. And ultimately, we probably want the bondholders to pay in those circumstances. That gives them also an incentive to hold the local authority to account. And that's quite different. And that might take a while, but there is scope, I think, for some improvement there.
Actually quite rare for local authorities to totally foul up their budgets. Really very rare. The central government fouls its budgets up ever so much more often than the local government does. It's just that this is kind of sort of, oh, we have to control everything that the Treasury goes in for. I don't like. I mean, devolution is such a politicised debate anyway, and there is an element of, well, let's chuck it out, all out to them, then they can deal with it, and we can still keep hold of the purse strings. But yes, there is this difference, isn't there? And it's how you decide what is appropriate for a local solution and what does need to be done from the centre. I mean, if you were going to build, if you're going to build an estuary airport, you'd probably want that to be a central decision because it's so crucial for UK infrastructure. But the future of, I come from Kent, which is what we're talking about, but kind of the future of a little local airport like Banstead was a decision for the local authority. Those kind of things. But it's not easy to decide where they fall, where the boundaries fall. And I think we're going to see particularly some interesting cross-border discussions and almost power struggles, particularly between the Scottish Government and the Westminster Government over what is the responsibility of each side.
Just on that, I mean, I share your cynicism, by the way, about the Northern powerhouse. Although it's not just a cynical manoeuvre. I mean, this is quite a deliberate sort of political strategy, I think, on George Osborne's part. That he's, put it this way, he doesn't appear to have read much Keynes, but he's very branched, right? So this is about developing hegemony. This is about changing how things operate in a fairly fundamental way. If you read the agreement between Greater Manchester authorities and the Treasury, it still retains immense control with the Treasury. And at the heart of the regional problem in Britain sits the Treasury and its attitude to the regional problem, which is broadly speaking to go, growth anywhere is good, therefore what's easy to get growth? Well, it's all in London, therefore that's what we think about more than absolutely anything else at all. And it's unusual, in fact, to see any regional issue and give it this prominence by the Treasury itself. There are other sort of sets of issues connected to that, which come down to kind of a fetishism of the Green Book, of the sets of rules that you have to tick off before any kind of investment is allowed anywhere as far as the Treasury is concerned. They're extremely tight on a very, very narrow accounting basis, and it would be much better if there was some capacity out there to think longer term rather than having everything on this short term and do the numbers add up at this point rather than what we're going to get at some point in the future. That if one of the things that we get out of any of the sort of discussions at the minute is a reduced power for the Treasury, and basically a beefed up power for something like an economics ministry that can think about those decisions, or for that matter some sort of national infrastructure planning body or something quite separate from the Treasury control, then you can start to think about what might be better solutions locally. But it is breaking that link and getting real power back to local authorities of a sufficient size that they can make these kind of decisions, because it's no good devolving, I would have thought, down to, for example, the immense number of local authorities you have in Wales, and they tend to be tiny out there, but you do have the Assembly. You need to make these things of a sufficient size and give them some capacity to make their own decisions and control their own budgets. 95% of local authority funding basically comes from central government. At that point, your local authorities are not doing much more than kind of working out where to spend stuff. They don't have a real power there. But you have to deal with the problem at the centre. And the problem at the centre, at least as far as administration goes, and as far as the economic issue of Britain goes, lies straight in the Treasury and the way it thinks and the way it acts and the immense amount of power it's accumulated.
Great. I'd like to thank the speakers once again for coming and creating a really insightful debate, and I hope it did for you guys sort of clear up whether people's QE would be a good thing or not. So thank you.